the number of countries in the Middle East, you would see, of course, that a couple countries with oil reserves have done reasonably well in terms of improving their GDP per capita. But otherwise, countries without those kind of resources, it's sort of a flat line. Latin America has shown some progress in terms of economic development during this period, but not nearly as dramatically as the rise that you see in this particular part of the world. And then sadly, in terms of African development, in many countries, it's essentially sort of flat line. So the point here is the fact that you've had a remarkable economic transformation in this particular part of the world. China, of course, is kind of the economic miracle in terms of the expansion of China, the economic development, particularly after 1978, when Deng Xiaoping began this whole notion of creating socialism with Chinese characteristics, really beginning the step toward privatization and private industry. I can remember early on, I was very interested in the fact that they had set aside 5% of agricultural land from the communes in China for private development. And within 1 year, that 5% of agricultural land was actually producing 10% of the agricultural product in the country. So it's an experiment that obviously went in the right direction. And of course, from that particular point on, they say the rest is history, but China really has had this remarkable transformation. I first visited China in 1979. Under President Jimmy Carter, we normalized the U.S. relations with the People's Republic of China on January 1st.
I think your microphone isn't working now. Tap on it. Oh, okay. And possibly the speakers or something. Anyway.
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me now? Should I?
Yeah. I can hear you just fine. I was concerned more about the recording.
Sure.
Yeah.
I understand. My first visit to China was in March of 1979. We had normalized relations with the People's Republic of China on January 1st that year. So it was kind of an amazing experience to be able to go that early after we had basically not had diplomatic relations for quite a number of decades. And this is exactly what Beijing looked like. People on bicycles, people all dressed the same. And it's one way of looking at kind of the transformation that you find. This is a scene on the main avenue, of course, right outside of where we were staying, the Beijing Hotel, Chang'an Avenue. And Chang'an Avenue, of course, is now filled with cars. You have a lot of modern buildings, a great, I guess, testimony to the kind of economic transformation. That's one of the reasons why I really am struck by, the pictures of change. This is a photograph of Shanghai taken about 1950 or so. My first visit to Shanghai was in 1981. And I brought back a number of photographs to show to my mother, particularly the area right by the river called the Bund. And my mother had visited Shanghai in 1936. And so she actually recognized the number of the buildings that were still there in 1981. And in my last visit to Shanghai, I was only 2 blocks from the Bund, but I couldn't see anything because of all the high-rise buildings all almost down to that area as well. This is an area across the river called Pudong, and you can see the transformation in Pudong across the way. And on a clear day, it really does look like a city totally out of the future. So in many ways, if you look at the photographs of China then and China now, it's really a testimony to the kind of dramatic changes that the country has undergone. In the previous chart, you of course saw China in the economy growing. Certainly has been the case for quite a number of years, very dramatic. Meanwhile, of course, China has dramatically reduced its poverty rate, and its poverty rate being very, very high, literacy rate not being quite that high. And the economic transformation, of course, has meant that only really a small percentage of people, around 2% or so of the population today, is considered to be below the poverty line. I put this chart up. This is a violation of the standard rules of using PowerPoint, which means do not put up too much economic data on one particular slide. But I would just call your attention, of course, to the financial crisis, which started in the United States in 2008. I mean, we talked about Lehman Brothers and subprime mortgages, and eventually that, of course, difficulty that we faced, of course, the whole contagion went elsewhere in the world, and that was reflected in much of the economic data in 2009. And you'll see that a lot of countries in 2009, including the United States, were in negative growth in terms of the GDP. Meanwhile, China and India were doing well. And so China continued to be and really emerged as sort of the engine of growth that kind of helped pull countries out of that economic downturn caused by the financial crisis in the United States. And then just taking that chart a little bit further, you will see, of course, the negative figures also for 2020 last year for a number of countries in the region and the United States, and of course the EU, the impact obviously of the COVID-19 pandemic. And China is one of the few countries that really didn't go into negative growth, largely because they were able to get a handle on the pandemic fairly early on, despite the fact that it originated in China as well. And of course, the United States and the EU suffered negative growth. I think a lot of countries are coming back. Part of those figures, I think, are slightly inflated simply because we fell so far behind in the last year. But China is certainly emerging from the pandemic, ironically, in better shape than other countries, and certainly in better shape than the United States. China under Xi Jinping, of course, a lot of people talk about the fact that several years ago, we used to talk about the fact that Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping. Now people are saying that he is the most powerful leader in China since Mao himself. And certainly he's been able to consolidate a great deal of power and authority into the three positions that he holds at the top of the leadership. She kind of emerged into kind of international notice when he became a member of the Politburo Standing Committee. He actually visited the United States and as the vice president of the People's Republic of China. And in 2012, he was basically elevated into two of the three most senior positions that the Chinese leader has: General Secretary of the Chinese People's Communist Party, chairman also of the Central Military Commission, and of course, then became president of China. Early on, I think in his sort of rise to power, he pushed very, very strongly an agenda of anti-corruption, basically not only cleaning up the country as a whole in terms of local practices, but also trying to reform the Chinese Communist Party, arguing very, very strongly that unless the Chinese Communist Party cleaned up its own act, it would have really no credibility in the public at large. And it also helped him sort of sidestep a few of his political rivals along the way, but it certainly was one of the things that he did early on to put his brand on China. He also, in 2013, I'll talk about it briefly, the Belt and Road Initiative, sort of major economic development program that he promoted. And of course, most recently, he is well into his second term as president. In the past, customarily, the president of the PRC would serve 2 5-year terms, but that particular obstacle has now been conveniently removed. And so I think Xi Jinping, for all practical purposes, will be around for some time. And starting in 2017, actually starting before that, but in 2017, a number of his speeches, a number of his sayings were sort of put together in a collection of books and documents known as Xi Jinping Thought. And it's rather interesting because this is a little bit reminiscent, of course, of a little red book in the term Times of Mao. But he does set out not only his beliefs in terms of China's destiny, China's future, and the notion of reform and rejuvenation. He certainly feels very, very strongly in terms of China's place in the world. And one thing I say to a lot of my students is that you have to really understand where China came from in the 19th century to understand this sort of fixation of reclaiming China's place in the world in this century. In the 19th century, of course, we know that the Qing dynasty, by the end of the century, was effectively carved up in spheres of influence, mostly by the European powers and by the Japanese as well. And Xi and his colleagues, of course, remind people it's not entirely, it's not exactly a selective use of history, but certainly I think the humiliation that China faced at the hands of the West in the 19th century is something that basically every school child learns in China. And so that underpins part of the very nationalistic kind of tone that you sort of witness coming out of Xi Jinping and some of his colleagues as well. This is also a little bit of a busy slide, but it talks about a lot of the issues that are currently facing the Chinese leadership and particularly Xi Jinping. They have done a good job in terms of dealing with the COVID pandemic, which I'll talk about briefly. And the question is, how do you sort of move the economy forward? There are obviously some hiccups along the way. Part of the Chinese economy was definitely affected by the shutdown. You've read, of course, about power outages. Ironically, that's because of the shortage of coal, the fixed price of coal, and also to a certain extent, of course, there are commitments to try to reduce their consumption of coal. But we certainly have seen a number of articles in the last week or so about some power outages. And obviously, that's a challenge to keep the economy going as well. One of the concerns that he certainly is facing in that is of debt, primarily of private companies, but a fairly high debt burden that a lot of financial institutions are facing. And the debt burden is also a characteristic of a number of state-owned enterprises as well. And part of the problem, of course, is lack of transparency, so that investors and the public at large don't actually know, to a certain extent, what these debt burdens are. And of course, you've also read in the last few weeks or so about Evergrande, huge property development company. And there's still a question mark as to what extent the Chinese government will sort of step in and try to rescue Evergrande, or at least protect some of the investors. So a lot of the investors are people that prepaid their apartments and of course stand to lose everything if Evergrande goes under and can't complete its projects. A number of journalists have talked about the fact that it's China's Lehman Brothers. I certainly wouldn't go that far, because the Chinese have a different political system and are and different set of resources that they can call upon to try to check the damage, the fallout from Evergrande, if Evergrande is eventually facing bankruptcy. Reform of state-owned enterprises. This has been a theme throughout the period of Xi Jinping. Corruption, against the anti-corruption campaign continues. Income inequality is something I'll be talking about in a little bit more detail, but it is ironic that income inequality in China today, and largely because of the economic miracle that the Chinese have witnessed, is pretty close to income inequality in the United States, which is pretty remarkable for a communist society built on the principles of sharing wealth with all. Demographics and workforce, I'll mention very briefly. Education, environment, Hong Kong, domestic issues, Hong Kong and Xinjiang province, what the challenges of Taiwan, and particularly their desire, of course, to reincorporate Taiwan into the body politic of China. And talk also about the expansion of the Belt and Road program, trade relations, and of course relations with the United States. So it's just a bit of a checklist of some of what I'll try to cover. I like the photograph on the side. We've been talking for at least a generation about maglev technology in terms of being able to move a train very, very quickly down the road. And this is the fastest train in the world now, and they just tested it I think a couple of months ago, and achieved 373 miles per hour. It's pretty remarkable. A lot of China's strength and military prowess, of course, was on public display in 2019 in the National Day Parade. This had pretty much a military theme to it. Some of missile technology, for example, which not seen publicly before, was on display. And it was the National Day Parade. It's October 1st. We're now in a week-long celebration in China of the National Day is actually turned into a National Week celebration. So there are kind of interesting manifestations of that, including record attendance figures at a movie showing celebrating the defeat of the Americans in the Chosin Reservoir in 1950. The air attempts of flying over the air defense identification zone in Taiwan and other expressions of nationalism associated with the National Day this year. In the pandemic, of course, the Chinese moved very, very quickly. This is a memorial to Dr. Li. He was the famous physician who basically said, this is not some kind of extraordinary pneumonia. This is a very, very serious virus. And as you know, he was called in by the police, told to not to be an alarmist. And originally when he died, of course, from helping COVID patients in Wuhan. And originally when his memorial was sort of posted on the Chinese internet, there was comment about the fact that he had actually been reprimanded not only by police, by local authorities, and that was an unpatriotic thing to do. And all of that commentary has now been deleted. And the only commentary you now see about Dr. Li is the fact that he valiantly gave his life in helping other COVID patients. That's one of the aspects, I think, of centralizing power and authority in China under Xi Jinping is the fact that there's a much, much tighter control of information. We all know, of course, about the Great Chinese Firewall. They have their own communication system within that particular structure, our own internet structure. It's highly censored, highly regulated. I found that out myself 2 years ago when I was in Shanghai and was unable to get to my UNC email account because of the Great Firewall of China. But the Chinese did move very, very quickly. Wuhan in February of 2020 was completely locked down. And Wuhan itself, a huge metropolitan area in China, was locked down for 76 days. And I think this photograph sort of graphically illustrates that everything was totally quiet and everything was locked down. This is also a chart that actually shows, this is the number of actual cases. So the Chinese really tended to put all of their resources into ending the pandemic. And as you can see, starting in March of 2020, they basically had just, in comparative data, just a literal handful of cases every day. And this is actual number of cases. This is number of cases per million people. And you can see that the Chinese are the bottom line along the way because they have brought the pandemic under control. But unfortunately, the United States has not done so well, particularly we now have resurgence. Other countries in Asia have not done as well either, but I think comparatively speaking, well, we obviously declared victory much, much too soon. We obviously have had real debates raging in terms of what's the best response. And the end result is that sadly, more Americans have suffered and died. The Chinese economy, of course, is a big challenge for Xi Jinping, and particularly coming out of this COVID period, but noted from the past that the Chinese actually didn't suffer negative growth in 2020, largely because they got the pandemic under control. But there are obviously some challenges in the economy. They have been trying to move toward domestic demand as a real driver of the Chinese economy. They do have problem areas, as I've mentioned, particularly loan structures. And the other thing that I think Xi Jinping is certainly trying to do is to make China more independent in one sense. They're putting a lot of money into developing the technology, high-tech infrastructure. One of the challenges, of course, is what we alluded to, and that is increasing income inequality. To sort of see that particular line, the first line, which you may not be able to read, is that the top 10% is the red line of that scene. You can see that the top 10% over time has really controlling a much, much greater share of China's national wealth, whereas the bottom 50% is controlling less and less as time goes on. So this is a real challenge, I think, for Xi Jinping and his leadership. One of the measures that economists sometimes use to really look at inequality is what they call the Gini coefficient. And this is where basically 0 on the scale, it's a 0 to 1 kind of a scale, and 0 is considered to be complete equality. And number 1 at the top is considered to be complete inequality. So not surprisingly, some countries in Latin America, some countries in the Middle East, and South Africa are pretty high up on the scale as well. But the interesting thing here is, to me, is the fact that China is almost equal to the United States in terms of this particular measure of income inequality. So that is a real challenge for Xi Jinping, and one of the reasons why he's increasingly talking about the need for common prosperity, as he calls it. And that's one of the reasons why he's been going after some of the high flyers in the private sector, Pony Ma, Jack Ma, Alibaba, Tencent, some of these companies. That's why there's a big question mark as to how much the Chinese will bail out Evergrande. They want to protect some of the little investors, but the big speculators. So it's sort of a lesson to the private sector. And the interesting thing, of course, is that Alibaba and Tencent have now publicly committed a much, much greater share of their revenues to the public good for public projects. They've obviously gotten the message in terms, but it's all essentially prompted by the realization that you do have rising inequality, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a country that's really based on socialist principles. Hong Kong, I put this photo up in 2019 simply because you won't see this again. The national security law that was passed in 2020 basically has imposed fairly severe penalties on people who demonstrate. COVID requirements have also been used. So the end result is that street demonstrations, public demonstrations like this in Hong Kong are sadly a thing of the past. When Hong Kong reverted to China in 1997, the understanding was that for some 50 years, Hong Kong would have a degree of autonomy. And in fact, at that particular time, it was called One Country, Two Systems. And obviously, the increasing demonstrations that we've seen in Hong Kong over the last 3 or 4 years have given some pause to the leaders in Beijing. So the end result is that they've come down fairly hard on protests in Hong Kong, shutting down one of the pro-democracy newspapers. Pro-democracy members of the local legislative body, some were banned and others quit in protest. So essentially the local legislative body is a rubber stamp, essentially, of Peking. So as I say, you won't see this photograph again. We also see a lot of news coverage about what's happening in Xinjiang province, Xinjiang, where you have a majority Muslim population in this vast area of Western China. Over time, not and quite predating, of course, Xi Jinping, the Chinese have recognized this as sort of a threat to Chinese authority, particularly in Muslim areas, quite concerned about Muslim separatist movement in Xinjiang. So they've not only had a much more visible police and military presence in Xinjiang, they've also tried economic development in the sense of building roads and high-speed rail, but also actually moving Han Chinese or ethnic Chinese into Xinjiang as well. And of course, most recently, we see a number of images of Uyghurs, mostly Uyghurs, but also some Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, in what the Chinese have euphemistically called vocational training centers. But we all know that basically they're sort of like re-education camps. And probably the estimate is that maybe 1 million Uyghurs or others from Central Asia have spent a considerable amount of time in these centers. Environmental issues, I think, are also a concern that I think a lot of people have been aware of for some time, that China has had to pay a price for economic development and competition in the world. And these are photographs taken by an activist named Lu Guang, and he was trying to put out the message within China that the Chinese really needed to do something about despoiling the environment as a result of industrialization. And so he was an activist, as I say. His audience was primarily in China, even though some of the photographs eventually went to the Western world as well. And this is a polluted water source in Guangdong province. This is also an interesting one of his photographs. Many of these photographs were published in the New York Times. This is a factory scene in Inner Mongolia, which is part of China. And this was a very lush green pasture where sheep were grazing. And of course, the locals remember that. And of course, the industrial pollution then killed the grass. Therefore, you couldn't put the sheep there. So now they've done replica sheep grazing in grass at this time. Lu Guang was taking photographs in Xinjiang province, one of the places, of course, of high sensitivity for the authorities. And he disappeared in 2019. And we had no idea what happened to him. But 2 years later, his wife reported that he is back home again. Obviously, he's seen the error of his ways, and he is no longer publishing photographs or commenting on environmental damage in China. But obviously, an issue that does have some considerable resonance, particularly in communities that have been really affected by pollution of water. Population or demographics. I love this photograph because this is a swimming pool, and I know that there's water in there somewhere. But China has had a large population, sustained a large population for many, many years. And as we know, China had for many years a one-child policy. Most recently, that's been changed to a two-child policy and even a three-child policy, even though I'm not entirely sure that young Chinese families are quickly responding simply because of the cost of education and raising a child in society. But nonetheless, China has tried to do something about the population that has been somewhat skewed more toward males and now more toward older workers. And there is a concern that with China's aging population, that there will be a much more dependent older population on the working majority of people. There is something called the dependency ratio, and it measures how many people between the ages of 15 and 65 are supposedly the workers, and those below the age or above that age are the dependent population. And in China, you're seeing an increasing number on the dependency ratio, and particularly on the aging population side. So that's of some concern. Our dependency ratio in the United States is still a little higher than China, but projections over the next decade or so show that we will have, at least from the working point of view, a more favorable dependency ratio than China. And the difference for us is immigration. And obviously, if we stop immigration cold, the demographics will change. But thanks to immigrants, we've been able to keep a slightly younger population in the workforce. Education is obviously a challenge, has been. China has made dramatic steps in terms of Chinese language for anyone who's mastered it. Very difficult, and of course they simplified characters in order to make the language more accessible to people. But it's been very dramatic in terms of the increase in literacy from 1949 until the present time. And of course, the emphasis has been on public education throughout the country. There is an argument back and forth that one of the reasons why you have income disparity is that the rural schools are not nearly as good as the urban schools, and that the urban parents who have more resources are able to put more money into the education process of their children. But obviously, it's a continuing challenge. The Chinese have also put a great deal of emphasis on university graduates. And I've met a number of Chinese who are the first in their families, in some cases, first in their families to even finish beyond 6th grade, to become university professors and others. One young professor I met in Guangzhou, his 3 brothers all had either PhDs or medical degrees, and none of their parents or any of the family they could ever remember had gone beyond 6th grade. So it's a remarkable transformation in terms of the emphasis on education, and particularly higher education. In 2000, I think there were about 1 million Chinese university grads. 2020, this last year, probably close to 7.5 million. And the challenge, of course, is that if you have an economy that may be stepping back just a little bit, to make sure that you have a place for all of those aspiring university graduates. And I don't think we have figures for 2020, but I think for 2019, almost 14% of those graduates were still not employed in a job, which was considered to be a satisfactory job 6 months after their graduation. So this is something that Chinese need to sort of pay attention to as well. The Belt and Road Initiative, this is to go back and use sort of historic terms in terms of the Silk Route, the land Silk Route, and also the sea Silk Route. And in the bold lines, you sort of see the concept that was enunciated first by Xi Jinping in 2013 to try to link together China and a number of the countries in Central Asia and basically create transportation communication lines that would enable, of course, the Chinese to get products to markets not only in Central Asia, but way beyond to Europe as well. And there's also, of course, the sea route, the belt, the so-called belt, which shows a number of sea routes that would link places like Sri Lanka, for example, and even West Africa. So that's basically the concept. It's a very, very ambitious plan. It's sometimes called the Marshall Plan, or China's Marshall Plan for Asia. Marshall Plan was largely grants, however. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is really designed, I think, to the economic benefit of Chinese companies as well. It is interesting, a lot of the construction for Belt and Road projects are basically done by loans. And some of them, they're very soft loans. Some of them have very, very generous repayment terms, but they're basically loans and not grants. And they also benefit, of course, Chinese companies. And it's no surprise that 7 of the 10 largest construction companies in the world are Chinese companies. And there has been, of course, overcapacity in China. And this is also one way of dealing with that overcapacity. Plus, of course, building a lot of friendship ties with these countries. There has been a little bit of a downside, I think a fairly well documented case of Sri Lanka, where a port facility was built by the Chinese with a long-term loan, and the Sri Lankan government, with a change in leadership, could no longer pay off that loan. So basically the Chinese took essentially a 99-year lease on the facility. So this is the concern. This is a little bit of the pushback that you see in terms of Belt and Road initiatives. This is a very important set of projects in Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, has been long a political ally of China, both concerned about India. This shows you, of course, some of the rather ambitious Belt and Road cooperative projects that are at least on the books for Pakistan. And in the far corner, you'll see the port facility of Gwadar. First of all, that's the Karakoram Highway that's been built from north and south. That's a new road that's been developed under the Belt and Road project. It's actually better known, I think, locally as the China-Pakistan Friendship Highway. It's reminiscent of the same thing USAID did in Thailand in the 1950s and 1960s, where we built the first road, the paved road between Bangkok and northern Thailand. Unfortunately, we don't do infrastructure any longer. In some ways, it's a missed opportunity. But this is the port of Gwadar. And this was designed to be part of the belt, the sea route around. And so far, it's been somewhat disappointing in the sense that it is underutilized, and they really haven't finished all of the transportation links that are required. So some people are looking at this as possibly, to use a Thai term, I guess, white elephant. But But at any rate, some people are concerned that some of these projects are much too ambitious and will eventually cost the so-called beneficiary countries a lot in the long run. We've paid a lot of attention, I think, to China's claim in the South China Sea. This map, I think, sort of highlights it fairly effectively. The bold line, of course, is China's 9-dash line, basically China claiming all of the South China Sea. And you can see the overlapping claims of other countries, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia having claims elsewhere. And of course, what the Chinese have done over the last decade, last 15 years or so, is to find some of these low-lying islands in the area and physically build them up so that they are now military facilities, or at least capable of sustaining military operations. And this is one in the Spratlys, which of course is also an area claimed by the Philippines. This is another example of some of the construction that they are doing elsewhere in the Spratlys. And of course, we have seen that there is more of a physical presence of the People's Army, People's Liberation Army Navy operations in the South China Sea. This has been very difficult, I think, for the United States and other countries who are really committed to open navigation in South China Sea, not recognizing Chinese claims. Philippine government actually took China to the International Court. China's claims were dismissed by the court, but the Chinese then proceeded to totally ignore the rulings of the court and still continue to insist that the 9-dash line is the boundary. So this has been difficult, I think, for countries in the region to respond to, particularly the countries with physical claims elsewhere in the region, but also to the United States. And what we've done is responded by so-called FON, or freedom of navigation exercises, where we'll send a US Navy ship with a couple of escorts into the area just to make the point. And so the problem is that as China becomes much more nationalistic in terms of its foreign policy objectives, that there's always the risk of some kind of accident or conflict. And of course, the whole issue of the future of Taiwan has certainly come up in the last few years, but particularly in recent weeks. And as I mentioned, of course, part of the celebration of China's National Day on October 1st was really marked by a number of overflights, not of actual airspace in Taiwan, but what is called Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, which is an area where Taiwan is warned of incoming aircraft. And so they have scrambled some of their fighter jets to sort of watch the Chinese. But the Chinese have sent a remarkable number of aircraft just to make a particular point. And certainly the rhetoric coming from Xi Jinping, and particularly from the PLA, has been much more forceful in terms of the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. Taiwan, of course, was a Japanese colony from 1895 until 1945. You could also argue that its relationships with the mainland were somewhat tenuous. At one point, it was sort of controlled more or less by the Portuguese in historic times. But nonetheless, China and, of course, the nationalist Chinese, who are now the Republic of China on Taiwan, both recognize that Taiwan is part of China. Different interpretation as to who is China. But what I'm concerned about, of course, is that in not too many years down the road, you will have the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And I think it's very clear, it seems to me, that Xi Jinping's great ambition is to somehow reunify China by whatever means. Now, in the past, it's always been assumed that this will be done by peaceful means, and that's certainly been the policy of the United States government. We have always said that we believe in there. We don't take a position on the actual claims, but whatever the disputes are in terms of the future of Taiwan, it has to be resolved by peaceful means. And of course, our relations with Taiwan are governed by the Taiwan Relations Act, which basically established an embassy in all but name in particular Taiwan, and we have continued to give defensive weapons to Taiwan over time as well. And over time recently, we have sort of escalated the level of engagement, officials coming from Washington to Taiwan. And of course, the Chinese response, this sort of what we've basically argued for is a policy of strategic ambiguity. I guess it's probably the right term. We've never said flatly that we will come to Taiwan's aid, but I think implicitly the notion is that we would come to Taiwan's aid if there was to be a conflict that was initiated by the People's Republic of China against Taiwan. And on the Chinese side, of course, we've seen years, and particularly last couple of years or so, an increase in the kind of negative rhetoric. The terminology has always been, we don't rule out the use of force for the eventual reunification. Most recently, China celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping speaking at Tiananmen Square. And of course, one of the major preoccupations, I think, on both sides is the trade relationship. I like this photograph because they're making American flags in this factory in China. But I think that's also one of my points, is the fact that while we often look at it one-dimensionally in the sense that the impact of Chinese exports to the United States, a huge dependency that we seem to have now on China for quite a number of products, including protective gear during the pandemic. There is also another side, and that is American economic interests in China as well. But at any rate, I have spared you from 3 solid slides with all kinds of graphic detail about Trump's tariffs and steps going all the way back to the tariffs on steel and aluminum products. But nonetheless, we, I think, know, not necessarily chapter and verse, but we know that quite a number of steps, fairly bold steps, using tariffs taken by the Trump administration to get the Chinese to address a number of issues, including level playing field, intellectual property rights, the trade imbalance. And as we also know, of course, at the beginning of 2020, there was a lot of fanfare associated with the announcement of so-called Phase 1 agreement. And the Phase 1 agreement basically had committed China to buy over $200 billion worth of additional goods from the United States over a period of 2 years, 2020, 2021. Unfortunately, maybe because, largely I suspect because of pandemic, but the Chinese fell short in 2020, probably 60 to less than 70% of the particular target. And this year in 2021, they're probably closer to 70%, but still looks like they'll miss that particular target. And we're still kind of waiting. We had probably the best understanding of what the Biden administration's trade policy was going to be toward China when Catherine Tai talked to CSIS 2 days ago. And in that particular speech, she first of all talked about our concerns about Chinese centrally directed economy, the state supported enterprises, and the absence, of course, opportunities for American businesses. But she seemed to also emphasize the importance of working with our allies and also doing something about our own domestic economy. And the interesting thing was sort of the tone, because it was didn't kind of list the very serious grievances right at the beginning. And so I think the tone of that meeting, or the meeting she will eventually have in the near future with her Chinese counterpart, will be much, much better than the results, for example, we saw in the Anchorage meeting, where Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, our Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, kind of ran into a firestorm with their Chinese counterparts, particularly with the unfortunate decision to let the press cover the first 20 minutes or so. So you had a lot of kind of negative commentary on both sides that was very, very difficult to walk back. But hopefully on trade issues, we're off to a slightly better start. She immediately left for an OECD meeting in Europe. And there is going to be a meeting with her Chinese counterpart, I think, in the near future as well. So I think some of us are hopeful. I think one of the problems, I think, with the Trump approach, first of all, it was going it alone. I mean, there were a lot of countries out there that had the same complaints about Chinese economic practices that we did. And to me, it was a real opportunity that we didn't work with other countries to rein in some of those unfortunate practices. And I also think that tariffs are kind of a very, very heavy edged weapon, because in many ways it's the consumers that are going to pay for the additional tariffs, not the Chinese government. And at any rate, I think that hopefully this administration will at least improve the atmosphere in terms of dialogue with our Chinese friends. This is one of several meetings between Trump and Xi Jinping. 2018 is the most serious, I guess, trade deficit numbers where we sold much less to China than we purchased. I included this particular slide because this is Tim Cook's visit to China. And the reason for this point is to also demonstrate that American companies have a real big stake in trying to get the economic relationship on a sounder footing, because Apple makes virtually maybe 98% of their products are made in China. They're manufactured by a company called Foxconn, which is from Taiwan. So it's kind of an interesting sort of three-way deal. But these factories in China are huge with really thousands and thousands of employees. And so Apple is in a particularly kind of difficult position because so much of their product is really sourced in China. I put this slide up as well because one of the retaliatory steps that the Chinese took in response to one of the rounds of tariffs that President Trump had announced was that they cut off the soybean trade. It's cut off and that was terribly important to American farmers in the Midwest. China was basically their #1 market by far, and so this was a real way of kind of retaliating in kind. And the interesting thing was that the way this political problem was faced, obviously, if you have a whole bunch of soybean farmers who can't find a market for their product, they're going to be unhappy with their government. And this was an important constituency for President Trump at that time. So basically what they did is they created a number of subsidies that were paid for by the American taxpayers to go to soybean farmers who had lost a significant part of their market. Again, just to illustrate, I think the importance that this is a two-way street, and we have real interests in China as well. This is one of my favorite McDonald's, at least in the appearances of this particular building. McDonald's, like other American companies, have been able to sort of adapt their product to the Chinese market. They did the same thing in Thailand, where we used to occasionally go out for a basil burger, which was sort of flavored with local Thai spices. This is my favorite Starbucks in terms of physical. I was once in a Starbucks in Beijing where I was absolutely astounded to find that it cost me a lot more for a 12-ounce latte in Beijing at the Starbucks than it did in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And yet the place was full of young Chinese professionals. KFC is a huge presence in China. They have over 4,500 outlets in China. This is one of the more interesting ones with other American brands, related brands there. They also have a fairly effective advertising campaign, finding young people who can be the face of KFC in China. And of course, KFC has also adapted its product, I think, for local tastes. But my point here is the fact that there are considerable economic interests that we have in trying to improve at least the atmospherics of the US-China trade relationship. This is an interesting photograph. This is from 2 weeks ago in Beijing, and it was the opening of the Universal theme park in Beijing. And this was a project that was long in the works, but it was hugely popular. And in the first few days, it was absolutely jammed with people, continues to be jammed with people right now. I guess I haven't been to a theme park a long time in the US, but I understand that you can get a VIP pass that helps you get, you pay a lot of money, you get to the head of the line, and it gives you certain privileges for the day or so. There is a VIP pass for this particular entertainment center in Beijing. It costs $450 for the day, and they are completely sold out to the end of the year. So it does give you some idea of how popular some of these American-inspired entertainment venues are. This is just one of many photographs of announcements made in the White House about ordering tariffs on Chinese products. And of course, I guess to his credit, they often accuse politicians of not living up to their campaign promises, but this was very clearly a campaign promise in the Trump campaign, that he was basically going to use tariffs to get the Chinese to essentially really improve the opportunities for American companies. This is in the category of one image is worth 10,000 words. These are huge flags, banners, keep America great. And this is for the Trump campaign in 2020. This photograph was taken, I think, late in 2018. It is the flag company, China, making the banners for Trump's reelection campaign. Anyway, I won't add further commentary, but I just think that's why I love PowerPoint pictures, because they can say so much that you necessarily can't. I think one of the unfortunate steps for us, I know it's somewhat controversial, but the whole business of having negotiated an agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then having pulled out of it. And I have to say that there was a lot of Democrats were also unhappy about it in the campaign in 2016. And Hillary Clinton was under a lot of pressure also to kind of denounce participation in TPP. But unfortunately, the TPP was, in fact, the best multilateral trade agreement that the United States had ever negotiated in terms of intellectual property protections, in terms of allowing labor unions to operate, in terms of environmental protections. It was by far the best agreement that we had, and we had played, of course, a central role. I'm sure that if we had not been part of the negotiations, a lot of those positions would not have been included in the final document. But at any rate, the United States then signed, and of course, very early in Trump administration, in fact, just a few days in the administration, Trump issued an executive order basically pulling us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And our colleagues in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they went ahead and did what is called a comprehensive and progressive agreement for a Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was basically the TPP with a slightly enlarged name, which included the rest of the countries that had signed on to the TPP in 2019. Most recently, of course, RECEP was brought into action. RECEP is another trading organization, and the importance of RECEP is the fact that it includes China. RECEP is not nearly as strong in terms of its protections and requirements as a TPP agreement is. I mean, there aren't the kind of intellectual property agreements. There isn't such language about state-owned enterprises. A lot of that language is kind of missing from the RECEP agreement, but it is another trade organization. And of course, you can see where the United States is. We are not players in either one of those organizations. There is a certain amount of discussion, I think, particularly in the business community, that we'd like to be associated with TPP once again, but I think for a whole variety of complicated reasons, including political opposition, I think the Biden administration will probably be several years before it feels like it might be in a position to rejoin TPP. But I think, unfortunately, this basically takes us out of the playing field in terms of economic relations in this part of the world. And in fact, most recently, 2 weeks ago, China announced its intention to apply for membership in the TPP. And of course, they're miles away from being able to do that because there are all sorts of transparency requirements. And of course, the requirements about environment and labor are all there in the TPP agreement. But nonetheless, just the gesture of saying we're interested in joining sends, I think, a fairly powerful signal when the United States has pulled back from all of this. One of the challenges, let me go back one if I can. One of the challenges that we have, of course, is the image of the United States abroad. And I think those of you who, for example, occasionally look at the Pew Charitable Trust polling data from around the world, you'll see that perceptions of the United States have turned, in many places, have turned negative. They certainly are down from where they were 2014, 2016, when they did a lot of polling data. And this is an image from Chinese television on the 7th of January. And you'll notice that when it was released in China, in fact, it was released a number of times and of course appeared in print as well. But the point that they always made was that this was a beautiful sight. And the reason they did that was this is exactly the same language that Nancy Pelosi had used in 2017 to talk about demonstrations in Hong Kong. So basically putting the language right back on us again. So for a whole variety of reasons, our mishandling of the COVID pandemic, domestic politics in the United States, a lot of these sort of issues are getting a lot of attention, of course, and the Chinese don't waste any particular effort to try to get the message out, not only to their own public, but to the publics elsewhere in Asia and the world, that China has the answers for the future, and the United States has probably had some answers in the past, but are no longer that relevant. So this is the perceptions of the United States abroad, I think, are a serious challenge. And just to close on this particular cartoon, this is when Obama faced the government shutdown and was no longer able to go to a couple of the ASEAN meetings and East Asia Summit back in the Obama administration. But I think it's really quite relevant today, particularly as we see the possibility of a government shutdown in the next month or so. And basically, we don't need to contain US power. They're doing it by themselves. So there we are for what I hope is a useful kind of introduction to your series of lectures. And I join you in looking forward to joining John Holden, at least virtually, when he joins you at the end of the month. Thank you very much.